Okay, hello everyone. So this week we're going to move into looking at what is going on in ancient Greece, especially in the early period. Now, what I have here is sort of a quick and dirty timeline, and you don't need to memorize all this, but I just want to point out a couple of places that we will focus on. So let me see if I can get my little pen to write here, get it red. So in this lecture, we're just going to focus pretty much on the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, and then part of the Bronze Age, which is the Mycenaean era. Um, we will look at the classical period next week. Okay, so if you remember when we first started talking about sustainability in this class, we talked about how with the Greeks, they believed that there were areas in their geography that contained gods and goddesses, and these places were special, like the sacred groves and so on. We also talked a little bit about how the Greek philosophers saw humans being above nature. Now, as I put a note here, you have to really remember the time frames that we're talking about. So Greek philosophers came quite a bit later, and it doesn't necessarily tell us what the people before the classical philosophers thought about their surroundings. One thing to remember as we're going through this, the ancient Greeks believed that there were four elements that made up the earth. So that was earth, air, fire, and water. And these things made up everything. And just again, a reminder, these ideas were parts of Greek philosophy that came a little bit later than the Neolithic period. So just keep that in mind. Okay, a few things to note when you're talking about ancient Greek sustainability. So in one respect, we know that they saw agriculture as being causing injury to nature. And so this is why they offered sacrifices to make up for this. We know from ancient documents, especially from the classical period, and a little bit before when the Greeks were going out through the Mediterranean and then creating settlements. Sorry, my cat's in the background. They would sacrifice to the gods whenever they would make up a new city or a new village. We can also look at ancient texts like the Iliad, which is the famous story about the Greeks versus the Trojans. We know that the Greeks made sacrifices whenever they hurt the earth in some way, or they were punished when they did this. So there's a very famous story in the Iliad about Poseidon. He gets very upset when the Greeks make walls that go down the beach and then go into the water, and he did not give them permission to do that, and he he tears everything down. There's also something called the Eden complex, and we talked about this before with some early Christian Jewish ideas, where they believed that the further back you go in nature or in time, the purer the nature is. Okay, so what I want to do is look at this specific period, the Neolithic, which of course is the new Stone Age, and then the Chalcolithic, which we haven't talked about before. These ages are kind of not totally specific, I'll just say. But it's when copper starts showing up. So copper is a metal that's mined. And I've given you the dates here, 5800 to about 3200 BC. We know from lots of different studies that agriculture had been done in Greece for a very long time. This included high mountainous areas down into lowland valleys. And we'll talk a little bit about how they did some of that. We also know that they did have thick woodlands in some places. And of course, we talk about pollen quite a bit. When you have people moving into an area, they tend to cut down the trees for various reasons. And we can see that the pollen count, the arboreal pollen or the tree pollen, actually starts to go down. Now, what's interesting, if you look at pollen and you look at a specific site, if you see an increase in tree pollen, what that might indicate is that a settlement has gone by the wayside, or something has happened in the environment that people had to move, and then trees grow back. So if you see a high pollen count and then a low pollen count, that might indicate people cutting down trees. And then if the pollen count goes back up, that might indicate that something is happening to the settlements that are there. And then of course, we've talked about cereal pollen and how that shows an increase in agriculture. Here's just a little bit of information from a book called Landscape and Land Use in Postglacial Greece, and it's actually a really good book. And again, it focuses on pollen counts. And I keep pressing this because, you know, in the ancient world, especially back in the Neolithic and the Chalcolithic, there's no writing. So we really are dependent on what the science has to say. So the presence of some pollen counts will tell us that there are probably people there. Pine trees can also show this existence. What tends to happen is that if you have oak pollen there, and then that decreases, sometimes you see pine pollen grow up because pines will grow in and grow faster than oak trees will. And they're sometimes referred to like a fill-in tree, where they will just pop up. And that might indicate that, you know, people have cut down the oaks and now pine trees are growing. This is also the same with fir trees. So these were pretty popular for people to use. You can look at the pollen counts. There's quite a bit of fir back in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic, and then they become almost absent. So people are cutting those trees down. And then beech is the same as sort of like pine. Beech will grow up very quickly in areas where other trees had been cut down. And you can look up some of this information on page 30 of that book. And then we do see in higher elevations pine trees disappearing. So people are also cutting down pine trees at higher elevations where they grow fairly easily. Okay, so again, you know, think about pollen. When you look at tree pollen and its relationship to a decrease in the pollen, it can show us that people were probably using their environment, cutting down the trees, and so on. And we can look for other pollens like chestnut, grape pollen might indicate that, you know, people are farming during this particular period. And no big surprise, when you look at like overall pollen studies, you see a great increase in them in the first century, in the first millennium BC, which is when people are really populating this particular area. So it's no big surprise that you see pollen from human-induced or human-grown plants showing a great increase during this period. Okay, I already mentioned that, you know, fir trees disappear. This is also the case for spruce. At the same time, you sometimes see an increase in walnut and chestnut pollen. Now, of course, these are two nuts that people can eat. So as opposed to an oak tree, though that's cut down for wood, people plant walnut and chestnut because they can then eat the nuts. Now, they're not a fast-growing tree, so this shows maybe a little bit of tree stewardship or nature stewardship, where they have to grow the trees, take care of them, and then eventually they will produce something that people can eat. Okay, one thing too that's happening in ancient Greece, and we've talked about this before, is terracing. This is on page 82 of the same book, Landscape and Land Use in Postglacial Greece. I just copied this table out here because it really helps us to understand what people are doing with terracing. And you see this land use in the south and on a lot of the islands. It's like some of the islands, you've got 80 or 90% that have been terraced because there's not a lot of flat land. And what I've got here, let me get my little pen out here, is reasons for implementation of the terraces. So soil management. And then these are the things that, you know, happen when you think about soil management and terraces. And terraces also help with water management. And then this is what they can do. For example, they can increase effective rainfall by capturing water and keeping it in certain places. It can also, you know, almost do the same thing, catch a lot of water that's coming down. It can reduce runoff. So if you're living on a hill and you have no terracing, water can just pour down the hill, causing lots of erosion. If you have terraces, it can't go down so fast, and then it's captured. And of course, you grow crops on terracing. Sorry, my other cat is in the background. And then this nice table shows a little bit about what can happen with crop management on a terrace. So for example, ease of harvesting. So if you imagine living on a steep hill and you're trying to harvest grapes, you know, it could be very difficult. But if you terrace, then you've got a bit of flat land, grow your grapes on there, and then you've got another terrace and another terrace. So terracing is actually really helpful for land management in the ancient world in a lot of different places, not just Greece. And then, we've talked about wood in terms of pollen. And back at the beginning of class, we talked a little bit about the uses of wood by people. So for example, one of the biggest things that people use wood for is building. And then they chop down wood to have fires. So we talked, I don't know if you remember the chart that I created at the very beginning of class, which talks about political power. So demand increases for certain things, say for lumber, because you can build, say, defenses. What this eventually does is it leads to deforestation, and then people travel further and further out, cutting down more trees. Eventually, the trees will start to disappear or get reduced, and then what you'll see is that the political power decreases. So it's sort of a circular type thing. Power and demand increases, you cut down the trees, your political power decreases, and so on. Now, another thing that we haven't really talked about in terms of what people did with wood is that they used it to make other things. So like pottery, you need a high level of heat to make pottery. And of course, with metallurgy, same thing. So a lot of wood is being used in this. And then if you look on our textbook, in our textbook on page 82 in Hughes, he will talk about the economy and how this all ties in together. Now, of course, one thing you want to think about is how the trees are removed. So once you get to the stage of metallurgy, you have axes and shovels. People can also remove trees with fire. So they start fire at the bases, weaken the tree, and then knock them over. Okay, so obviously, when you've got a bunch of tree cutting, and you see this, like, you drive up in the Sierras, there's some places where, and in Oregon in particular, where you can see they cut down a lot of trees, and if they don't plant something right away to replace them, you get a lot of erosion. And not only that, you get silt buildup at the bottom. So all this dirt rushes down where the trees were and the tree roots had held the soil. Down at the bottom, it starts clogging up rivers and streams and so on. Over time, you get the moving of coastlines, where this is especially the case in Troy, where it used to be a city fairly close to the Aegean Sea, and now it's kilometers back because of all the silt that has been built up through the rivers. Now, of course, this makes it hard for trees to come in and grow in the same area because of the loss of soil. Now, people, when they cut down trees, they use them to build, they burn. They also then move animals in to graze. Now, this causes more issues. And we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where grazers are important for humans because what they do is they take the animals and they eat grass, they eat tree shoots, they eat a bunch of things that people don't eat, and then you've got meat. So that's one of the things that they really do. And I put it here, convert inedible material to humans so that we can then eat the animals. Now, of course, we know that there are dangers to these grazers, and goats in particular are pretty bad because they will eat everything. So they're going to be eating seeds, which, if the trees are trying to grow back or anything, you eat the seed and the plant is dead. You eat the shoots. If you get it before you get more branches, that will kill the plant. And then they will also eat small trees. So the grazers really prevent the reforestation from happening. And of course, you get erosion, where you can't get the soil held down by roots of plants. It rains and all that beautiful soil gets washed away. Okay, now I want to switch to a little bit later time, down into what's called the Mycenaean period. And around 1200 BC, you have the collapse of what's called Bronze Age Greece. Now, before this period, during the Mycenaean period in Greece, it was a high point. So we always think of Greece, and you think of like the classical period with the Greek philosophers and so on. People really need to start thinking about the Mycenaean period because it was another great period where the very first slide I showed you, I should have pointed it out, that was a city-state called Mycenae. And beautiful buildings, all stone walls and so on, with a city there, and then the surrounding areas, which is where all the agriculture was happening. So sometimes they were called city-states. And in ancient Greece, you had like one king of Mycenae, and he controlled his area. And then you had like the king of Sparta and so on. They weren't a single territory. Now, sometime around 1200 BC, or it's sometimes referred to as the 3200 before present event, you see a whole bunch of civilizations collapsing. So you've got Mycenaean Greece collapsing. You've got the Hittites, they're having lots of problems. You have the Canaanite cities in like where Israel and Palestine, Syria, Lebanon are located. And also in New Kingdom Egypt. So last week we talked about Egypt, the invasion of these sea peoples. This is what's happening around this time. And it looks like there's just maybe mass movements of people. The Egyptians refer to these people as the sea people, and they're invading. Greece and Asia Minor have the same issues. It looks like, and it's possible, that this was due to climatic change during this period, where a drought started. So now I'll tell you, there's lots of debate in the scholarship right now about whether this actually happened. But some of the sources that I'm pulling from say that, there's a 300-year drought that started. And of course, with the drought, we've seen this in ancient Egypt, where the Nile doesn't flood as high. You get less food and so on. So there are crop failures. This leads to food shortages. People don't have enough food to eat, and there's social upheaval happening. And then you get the invasion of these sea peoples. And think for a second, maybe it's not an invasion. Maybe it's just hungry people moving around to places where they know there may be food. What's amazing about this period after the collapse of ancient Greece, so the Greeks wrote before this in another script. When the Dark Age happened, they forgot how to write in that script, and it's the same type that you're looking at now is what they learned from the Phoenicians. So they totally forgot how to write because it was writing took place at the government level, and if there's no government, there's no writing, so they forgot how to write during that period. Many of these city-states, palace structures, therefore the economy, because the economy was centered around these cities, it collapsed. And we know that population numbers were way lower than they were before. So something terrible is happening, and it may be related to climate change. And then possible results. So, and this is not just the case for ancient Greece. You can apply this to lots of other places. I mean, we just looked at what happened in ancient Egypt. This is going to happen in lots of other places. You get conflict because people will then fight for the resources that are available. So if there's food someplace, they will start fighting to get it, especially if they're hungry. People will then die of hunger, and you'll get reduced populations. Your reduction in populations may also indicate not that they're dying, but that they've moved somewhere else. So if you're looking at a settlement and the population gets reduced, you don't necessarily have to think that they all sat down and died. They might have moved somewhere else, which of course is migration. So climate change or any type of degradation of farmland may cause things like this. Now I've got some data here for you to look at. So this is rainfall reconstructed from what's called speleotherm. This is like caves. So stalactites and stalagmites where they cut them, and then they look at some of the data, some of the isotopes that are inside. This is the line that I want you to concentrate on. So what this is showing is that rainfall amounts are decreased. So you get a big decrease again here. You get sort of a more steady decrease here, but you can see there's the trend. So decrease in rainfall. Here's also surface temperatures. So, and again, this is the line we want to focus on. This is the time for the collapse of the Mycenaean Greece. So you see maybe a little uptick and then a big downturn in terms of sea temperature. And again, you see this here, you see this here, and it's happening a little bit earlier here. So something is happening where the sea temperature is lowering. And as you can see here, a drop in the sea temperature can indicate lower levels of evaporation, which in turn indicate less precipitation, which of course is drought. And then this is looking at solar irradiance, so how bright the sun is. And again, this is the line we want to focus on. What this data is indicating is that you've got a pretty good reduction in the amount of sunlight, which will reduce temperatures. So you've got a drought and you've got it colder happening around the time of the collapse of Mycenaean Greece. And then finally, what's really interesting here is that the recovery, so around 800 BC, you get a repopulation, you get the growth of these city-states in ancient Greece. They don't seem to be related to climate change. So it's not like the climate change gets warmer or it gets wetter so that you can grow more things. What it looks like is people recovered based on the technology that they made. So innovations in agriculture, especially the use of iron plows, iron sickles, beginning around 1000 BC. So with the creation of iron, or the use of iron and the creation of plows and sickles, you can dig up the dirt much better than you could before. So again, it's not climate that's bringing people out of the Dark Age. It's their own creations that are helping to do this. And so, or helping, not helping. So around 800 BC, you see these new structures showing up all over. Interesting, outside of Greece, in Syria, you also see an increase of population during this period. So lots of interesting things are happening during the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and then later into Mycenaean Greece and the Dark Ages. Now, next week, we will look at a few things that are happening in classical Greece.